wait about one more minute and then we're going to get started. Again, I appreciate everybody's patience as we give a little bit of time for those that may have had the wrong time on their calendar invite to join. The one thing I'd ask is for those not presenting, if you wouldn't mind turning off your cameras, makes it a little easier for others to view.
And can you just confirm if you can tell whether or not I got that recording started?
You did. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, well, we're going to jump right in. So thank you everyone again for your patience and also for joining us today. My name is Ben Edelman. I'm a researcher here at the Center for Advancing Research in Transportation Emissions, Energy, and Health. And today we have two researchers from the Texas A&M Transportation Institute who are going to talk about the planning, policy, and economic impacts of expanding electric vehicle infrastructure in the United States. They have a bunch of interesting findings and future needs to discuss today. So we have Alice Grossman. Alice is an associate research scientist with the Center for Advancing Research in Transportation Emissions, Energy, and Health at TTI. Her research covers various areas of multimodal transportation with a focus on accessibility, technology and transportation, vulnerable road users, safety, and performance measurement. Alice works within the Air Quality, Energy, and Health Division at TTI, and she also leads the Clean Transportation Collaborative, which she will be talking about today. Alice is going to get us started and then hand it off to Jacqueline Cuzio. Jacqueline is an assistant research scientist in the Infrastructure Investment Analysis Program at TTI. In her role in this program, she conducts research on transportation funding, finance, and economics for a variety of modes, including highways, transit, aviation, and rail. She has worked on a range of projects, including policy analysis, economic impact assessments, as well as legal reviews related to transportation. So Alice will kick us off today, and then Jackie will go ahead and provide a bit of findings from a research project that she conducted here at CARTEEH. And then Alice will kind of finish us off talking a bit about stakeholder engagement, future needs, and then we will open up for question, answers, and discussion. So I'll hand it over to you. Thanks, Alice.
Great, thank you, Ben. So yeah, welcome everybody. As Ben said, we're gonna start with a little bit of background on the policy and planning from a federal and state level to get that context for the study that Jackie's going to go more in depth on, looking at the economic impacts of EV infrastructure expansion in the metro areas in Texas. And then we'll pull back out after she goes through her methodology, the tools they built, the scenario analysis, and some recommendations in future research, and talk about the stakeholder engagement that's needed when you go through any type of study or action like these EV plans, and then end up with just a little bit of basics on where Texas is as a state right now in terms of their planning and EV adoption. So we'll start out looking at this federal framework sort of background and how that the infrastructure bill that passed in November of 2021 came about and is having an impact on what we're doing in terms of state, regional, and local planning for electric vehicles these days. And so if you take a look here at the image that we have up, one of the big challenges with the move for transportation electrification is that we're building new relationships and we're really starting to overlay different networks and human behavior patterns in a way and at a scale that we haven't done before. So looking at this convergence between the transportation network and the electric grid and the power structures going into that and the human behavior behind energy and transportation usage, is really necessary to understand to be able to do our models and build the kind of tool and make the kinds of estimations that Jackie's going to be talking about later. So one of the ways that we have been able to do this and move forward is really coming down from that top-down oversight from the federal government, as well as some of the more local initiatives and taking that bottom-up initiative. So we'll start out talking about that federal framework. And one of the ways that they have been supporting this new need for understanding of the interaction between the electric grid and the transportation network is by literally forming a joint office between the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation, and looking at specific goals like supporting electric vehicles. There's really a push to electrify from that top-down level. And that should be leading to fewer emissions, better public health, more job creation, and meanwhile, thinking about this from an equitable perspective, which we're also going to dive into a little bit in the case study that Jackie will be talking about, and thinking about how we can get that equity from the mobility sector and the energy sector as we move forward with such a big change to how we're thinking about transportation systems and networks. So not only are we looking at this from a policy and oversight perspective, but also there were a number of programs, new programs that came about in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And so I just put a list of those up here, and we don't need to go through all of them necessarily. Some of these you guys might have been seeing in the news recently. This Clean School Bus program just came out, I think last week or the week before. The carbon reduction program a little bit before that. And the one that we're actually going to be looking at more today is this very first one on the list, which is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or NEVI and EVI, which is formula funds for the states to do some electric vehicle planning, and some of that can be used for urban areas as well. But then I'm going to actually point to the second one here on this chart, the charging and fueling infrastructure, which includes competitive grants, which can also be used for those metro areas that we're going to be focusing on. But you'll see when we finish up our conversation today, we're going to circle back to this overall NEVI framework that's sort of coming a little bit more down from the top down. So when we think about how we are applying these funds to get that infrastructure, that electric vehicle charging infrastructure in and able to utilize, that's thinking about really how we need to do our planning from the beginning. So up until recently, a lot of the electric vehicle charging infrastructure that's been installed has been a little more perhaps haphazard, and has gone in places where people have showed a specific amount of desire for it or had that opportunity. But the federal government, in order to bring these funds out, has asked states to really think about more of a holistic planning element behind this infrastructure investment, to make sure that we are not only getting those equitable benefits that we talked about before, but also able to optimize as best we can that interaction between the transportation and energy grid as well. And so today we're going to be looking specifically in this process at some of those modeling and tools that go into these plans, the importance of the intersectoral stakeholder engagement behind it, and how those relate to funding and payment options. So we're going to be looking at this from a scenario planning perspective in a way, and I bet most of you on the call are familiar with scenario planning, but just in case for those who aren't, I'm going to do a quick overview of what scenario planning is, and then you'll be able, again, to see that in use in the work that Jackie is going to be presenting. So this is really similar to most transportation planning processes. We're kind of starting out with this data collection and figuring out what's the baseline, where are we, and sort of how are we going to organize our study and think about what goals we want to accomplish in that study. once we set those goals and those baseline values, we're able to get into the scenario aspect of scenario planning. So now we're down here to number 4, which is working off of that baseline and thinking about alternative scenarios, which could be things like different rates of electric vehicle adoption, different rates of population growth, different inputs into the electricity grid, all sorts of different sort of potential future scenarios. And so then we can get a good idea of a range of outcomes and think about how we can be developing policy and decision making to help shift that movement into the future to reach the targets and those goals that we have established here in step 3 that we're really aiming for. And then from there, we kind of look at our outcomes and think about how we can be moving forward in the direction that we want to, and what challenges we might come across on the way as well. So that's kind of what scenario planning is. And then why are we using scenario planning? Especially right now, we're moving forward again very quickly in a realm that's a little bit new to a lot of people. So as we are, envisioning land use, energy, and transportation scenarios for future growth, it's really all estimates at this point. And so we are doing those different scenarios to be able to have a better perspective on what we might end up seeing. And this is where some of those tools and models can really come into effect and give us a more detailed view of the options of what we might be seeing in the future. And as I said before, we can use that to really maximize the system performance and get reach those targets and goals that we have been working towards anyway. So the last thing that I'm going to set the stage for before we dive into our economic study is just thinking about how we're considering equity as we're moving forward. And we're focusing on this for a minute just because equity has become a little bit of a buzzword in the field, but we don't always come from the same place as to how we're defining that, and sort of what do we mean when we talk about transportation and energy equity. So I'm going back actually to the definition of equity theory from behavioral science and economics, which when you think about economic studies in transportation and how people move and behave really is behavioral science and economics. And so that's thinking about distributive justice in a way more than sort of just a push for thinking about how to reach equality and outcomes through equitable policies. And so that is kind of going back to the planning process, which is starting with a baseline and thinking about where we're starting and what populations might be impacted, but also what are those changes going to be over time as different policies and plans and scenarios sort of evolve moving forward, and estimating the impacts on different populations and trying to figure out how we get to that fair or just distribution of goods and outcomes, which could be access to mobility, it could be access to clean air, it could be access to energy, it could be looking at costs of vehicles or charging. So there's a lot of different ways to frame this, and I will let Jackie get to that later in her talk and turn it over to her now to discuss the study on the economic impacts of infrastructure in metro areas in Texas.
Thank you, Alice. So yeah, I'll be talking a little bit more about the economic impacts and the study that we did. The rest of the research team at TTI is named on the slide as well. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. And so just to give a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So first I'll talk about kind of why we wanted to do this research, why we thought it was important, before jumping into kind of the method that we used, the economic tool that we developed, the scenarios that we kind of use to show how this tool can be utilized by planners and policymakers, and then finish off with some recommendations on future research. And so in terms of our kind of research rationale is that and Alice is going to talk a little bit more at the end about specifics for Texas, but we are seeing an increase in EV sales. And we're expecting to see the market grow, especially with manufacturers switching to, you know, fully electric vehicles and fully electric vehicle sales in the future. But alongside that, we're going to need a robust charging network to make sure that, you know, people feel comfortable in adopting electric vehicles. So research has shown that one of kind of the major indicators of EV adoption or plug-in electric vehicle adoption is the availability of charging infrastructure in especially convenient locations and at kind of faster speeds. And so in order to create that network, we do think that public investment is going to be key, especially when we're thinking about equity considerations and that distribution of the charging infrastructure. And so to that point, we wanted to highlight some of the economic benefits. So the research has done a lot in terms of both the environmental kind of social benefits that we get from electric vehicles, and obviously then electric vehicle infrastructure. What we wanted to do is kind of focus on spurring public investment by highlighting some of those economic benefits. And so next slide. And so in terms of our methodology, we really use the literature to guide kind of the assumptions that we used in our tool, as well as to identify any additional or new data sources that we would need to complement what we have available to us here at TTI, and as well as help with some of the calculations. And so we ended up with two key components, the benefit cost analysis and the economic impact analysis. So the benefit cost includes kind of travel time savings, and through this we were like those convenient locations, so better access to charging. Environmental cost savings from a switch from the traditional internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, as well as safety cost savings. And then under economic impact, we have kind of the combined direct, indirect, and induced impacts of that investment in charging infrastructure and installation in terms of economic output, employment, and wages. And so for the economic benefit tool, again, this is intended to be used by kind of planners and policymakers. So we have a couple of kind of user-controlled inputs that I'm going to be talking through on this slide. And so the first is the regions in Texas. So we have 25 of the metropolitan statistical areas, or MSAs, as well as the rest of Texas region for anybody that falls outside of those metro areas. That's going to kind of, it's not going to give as kind of specific of an economic impact, but it'll give a sense of what you might expect of a return on your investment, in a sense, on your EV charging infrastructure. We also have two EV adoption rates. So this is kind of the EV market share in your region. These were using forecasts developed by researchers at CARTEEH. And so we included slow and average within the tool. A distance to charging infrastructure, that we have a baseline that's set in there, but really this is where local knowledge and kind of that kind of scenario aspect of what you expect it is right now and what you hope to get to comes into play here. And then finally, we have a range of different charging facility types and sizes. So we only have level 2 and 3 just because these are going to be publicly accessible. Level 1 is more of your home charging, obviously. And so we focus on level 2 and level 3 or DC, DC fast charging stations. And then in terms of outputs, we have our benefits related to reduced travel time, installation infrastructure costs, and then the two kind of key outputs, which is the benefit cost ratio and the economic impacts. And so this is kind of the overview of what the tool looks like. It is in Excel to make sure it's accessible to as many people as possible. And those kind of inputs that I talked about on the last slide are highlighted in yellow here to show you which ones you can change. And then we also have included in here kind of a baseline number of charges, which is essentially the number of charges that the region had as of 2020 or 2021 when we completed this research. And so we outlined the number of level 2 and level 3 publicly available charging stations, and then what you would need based on forecasts and kind of research on the number of charging stations required per 1,000 electric vehicles by 2025. So as you can see for Abilene here, they would need an extra 8 level 2 charges, but just an extra 1 level 3. And so once you've made your changes to the inputs there, it all goes across to the outputs, and you would see kind of what your, total costs would be, as well as your BCI, your benefit cost ratio, and your economic impact. And so next I'm going to talk about the scenarios that we developed. And so the first one is kind of our most basic scenario. It's just to show the comparison between our slow and average adoption rates that we have in the tool. And so this is the idea that, not all metro areas are probably going to see the same rate of growth, especially if they're starting off from a point of having less availability of charging infrastructure. So if you think of kind of Austin and Houston, they do already have kind of a bigger charging network than some of our smaller or mid-sized urban areas. So for this one, we use Tyler, Texas, and this Tyler's in East Texas, for those of you not familiar with Texas, kind of southeast of Dallas. And they have a population around 235,000. And so if you go to the next slide. In terms of this is kind of the result of these two different scenarios. And so the second line in the table shows you kind of the additional infrastructure they need, the second and fourth lines. In terms of the slow and average adoption. And so obviously under slow adoption, Tyler's already fairly well prepared. They only need an additional 2 level 2 chargers, and they're already okay on level 3. They actually have 8 fast chargers available in the Tyler metro area currently. But then when you look at the average adoption, it's obviously quite a big jump. And so this is where they would want to take into consideration maybe, okay, so slow might be a little too slow for us, but average might be too much right now. And so kind of thinking about maybe there's some somewhere in between that they can focus on. And another consideration with Tyler is that their major employer is the healthcare sector. And so thinking of those places where level 2 specifically charges would be well placed could be those kind of hospital, medical center locations where people spend more time or spend, obviously their full work day there as well. And so in terms of our second scenario, we have kind of a policy scenario, which was evaluating Austin's community climate plan. This has actually been superseded by their climate equity plan that was adopted last year. But we focus on this one from 2015 because they had kind of some specifics on how they saw the region changing in terms of EV adoption. I do want to note this was only one strategy they had for meeting their climate goals under transportation. They also were focusing on active transportation and increasing transit use as well. But in terms of electric vehicles, they had kind of 3 different potential forecasts. So like the low, mid, and high. And these were for 2050. So they're a little bit further out than our calculator goes. Our calculator is focused on kind of 2025 to 2034, that kind of 10-year time range of what we see as the potential life of an electric vehicle charging station, the life of the asset essentially. But we did model this just to give you an idea of kind of what will be needed to scale to this level. And so in terms of the results, so as you can see, this is a lot of charging infrastructure that will be needed in the Austin area. And I will say Austin's probably starting off from kind of a better point than most urban areas in Texas. But these are pretty ambitious goals, but I think that as we kind of grapple more with air quality, climate change impacts, we are going to see that we need to ramp this up. And so I don't know, I don't know whether by 2025 we'd even see the low adoption, but this gives an idea of kind of how much additional infrastructure they might need. But even with that being said, as you can see, all of the benefit cost ratios remain positive, regardless of the level of investment that they need to make. And you see that economic impact. Obviously, this is going to support kind of a range of new jobs within this sector, within the clean transportation sector, as we get more into kind of installation, maintenance, and just building out of these charging stations. And then our final scenario is specifically focused on kind of some of those equity and distribution concerns that we talked about. So we looked at charger locations in Houston. And so we have 3 different neighborhoods in Houston that we kind of assessed what the impact will be in terms of a potential reduction in emissions related to an uptake in EV ownership, related to that access to EV charging. And so for those not as familiar with Houston, and I'm going to hopefully get this right because I'm not that familiar with Houston, but the third ward is kind of downtown towards the southeast, but very much in downtown Houston. North Shore is a little bit further to the east, kind of northeast of downtown. And then Friendswood is actually a city in the greater Houston kind of metro area to the southeast. So it actually falls across Harris and Galveston County lines. And so in terms of this scenario, we just looked at kind of installing one charging station in these neighborhoods. So we were just looking at the impact that would come from having, one point where you had 2 level 2 and 1 kind of level 3 charging station available to you, or charging point available. And so this just kind of shows you that obviously there are positive economic benefits to the region from installing that, but these benefits will be to the entirety of Houston. We couldn't really get it granular enough to get it to the neighborhood itself in terms of employment, especially. And so on the next slide, we have, this is where we looked at kind of that reduction in emissions and what the kind of benefits related to that reduced exposure to pollutants, specifically from transportation, would have. And so with our first 2 neighborhoods, you would have seen that they had a higher percentage of people living in poverty and a higher people of color percentage as well in terms of their population. And so we see that there will be greater benefits to these regions related to that reduced related to the reduced pollutants in terms of health benefits. There are some caveats here. So we only looked at the reduced mortality risks. And so there wasn't kind of a good enough idea of the cost savings related to the health impacts when we consider other risk factors and other health outcomes, so maybe from lower rates of respiratory illnesses. And so these are also only on an annual basis, and so I think they present kind of a snapshot, but give you an idea of kind of maybe the different health outcomes that we could have if we really thought through where we wanted to put these charges, and we think through areas that are currently suffering due to poor air quality, poor environmental conditions that are specifically related to transportation as well. And so kind of in terms of all that and the recommendations that we came up with, I think that this research has shown that there are clear economic benefits to Texas metros from investing in these charging stations, but there does need to be kind of some of that scenario planning taken into account. So kind of thinking of where you want to be in the next kind of 5 to 10 years and what the investment level will take. As well as thinking through that kind of equity piece, especially as we see kind of the focus at the federal level in terms of the Justice Faulty initiative, really wanting to focus on those disadvantaged communities as they've set out. But along with that, we have to think of both access to EVs as well as access to EV infrastructure. So I know I mentioned that access to EV infrastructure kind of helps adoption, but I do think that there is going to need to be kind of grants and rebates in place. There's also going to help, especially lower income areas, access cleaner transportation. And then finally, in terms of conclusions, so we do think that understanding the economic benefits, especially for Texas, is important to be able to help spur that public investment. But as I said, there are other considerations that need to be taken into account. We didn't really get into, apart from that third scenario, the location of charging infrastructure, and I think that's an area where there's a lot of research going on now, is where do we best place this infrastructure to have the most impact. But we also need kind of further research in terms of kind of the cost savings that we try to calculate here in terms of environmental and health benefits, but also some of those qualitative aspects. So, community engagement and understanding where the needs really are. And on that note, I'm going to hand it back over to Alice.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jackie. Interesting findings, and I think, it really sort of hits home on the fact that we need to be planning proactively for EV infrastructure, especially if we want to make sure that we're getting those community benefits for public health and equitable access to both vehicles and charging availability. So to that point, part of that planning process, as we talked about earlier, is making sure that we do this stakeholder engagement, and some of that is trying to help figure out what scenarios we need to be considering as we move forward in the planning process, and also making sure that we have that connection between the transportation and energy sectors, who are all working towards some of the same goals, such as making sure that we're not overloading our grid, that we have cleaner air, with those better public health outcomes, hopefully as equitable as possible, and that we're efficiently using our space, both publicly and privately, which is also thinking about that efficient installation of infrastructure. So I think that example that Jackie gave of the looking at high employment rates at a medical center, for example, can give you those insights to thinking about how you can most effectively reach these goals for all of the different stakeholders and the general, including the general public. So what are we doing at TTI to help work on that element of the planning? One of our major initiatives is this Clean Transportation Collaborative that Ben mentioned at the very beginning of the hour. And so we are bringing together the stakeholders across sectors in, public sector, private sector, academia, energy, charging installers, transportation sector, and really looking at how we can start those conversations and make sure that we are getting the best estimates and baseline data for those models and tools like the ones that Jackie and her team are developing, and also helping them inform what direction our research should be going in terms of what stakeholders at different levels and in different areas are interested in looking at, and again, kind of getting that interaction between research and practice, and that interaction between people in different disciplines and sectors and geographies, which is really important to be able to get the best estimates and the best outcomes that we can. So just to dive a little bit more into that, if you look at that in a more visual view of who we're trying to bring together and how they might be segmented right now, we're really trying to cross, as I said, cross these disciplines. And that's going all the way from, back in the supply chain, looking at EV battery development and life cycles, for example, and then going into the entire vehicle manufacturing. The same thing with electricity, thinking about what's going into the grid, how we can be working in microgrid or off-grid potential as well, and looking at V to G, for example, not just grid to vehicle charging, and then looking all the way back out as well to those end users, which can either be sort of looking at fleets, like public fleets or transit or private fleets, delivery, or just sort of the general public and private citizens in general as well. And so we've already brought these people together, stakeholders together for some conversations, and we have been working on communication between them and decision makers as well, and really trying to break down these lines that you see between the different areas and disciplines to get those conversations going and get our research oriented from a more holistic perspective as well. And so with that, we're going to just look quickly based on sort of what's going on in Texas at a state level now and how that backs up some of the work that Jackie did and can inform our future research as well. So we have numbers, and this goes back to that NEVI plan that I mentioned at the very beginning of the hour. So Texas DOT has been working on their electric vehicle planning efforts as guided by the federal government and the funds that are coming through that National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure or NEVI program. And so even just a little more than a month ago, Texas already had over 125,000 electric vehicles registered in the state. And I think the most interesting thing about that number is looking at the trends over time. And Jackie talked about sort of how we're projecting those numbers, and we don't know exactly what the curve is going to look like moving forward. But over the last couple of years, even just since 2020, the total number of EVs in the state has gotten close to tripling. And we can see that in 2022, those data show that there's a large proportion of the vehicles that are 2021 vehicles. So we really see large adoption rates now. And the question is, how is that going to move forward in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and 30 years? And so TxDOT is developing their plan. They're moving forward very quickly and have done a lot of work. And that plan is actually out for public comment now. For those of you who are interested, I would recommend taking a look and seeing what you think and making sure that we get that stakeholder and public engagement going. They even conducted listening sessions, stakeholder listening sessions as part of that plan development. So there shouldn't be any surprises in there for anybody taking a look as well. And it's a good complement to some of the work that Jackie was talking about, because at a state level, they're really focusing on those interstate routes and making sure that we're thinking about equity in terms of rural and urban populations as well. So combining that with these efforts and models at an urban level is a good way to get a good holistic perspective on what's going on in the state right now. And so with that, we're going to open it up to all of you for questions. And here's our contact information. Feel free to let us know over email if you have additional questions as well.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Jackie. Those presentations were excellent, extremely informative, and we really appreciate the time and effort that the both of you put into putting this together and taking the time to present today. Doesn't look like we have any questions. If anybody does have a question, please feel free to, you can drop it in the chat and I can read it, or you can go ahead and raise your hand and unmute yourself and go ahead and ask that question. And while we're waiting for folks to pop up, I'll go ahead and ask Jackie a question about her analysis. Were commercial or fleet vehicles included in your analysis?
No, so we did not include either one of those. And I think commercial, it's because the charging kind of needs for commercial vehicles are not as clear right now. And also they were less likely to be publicly available and data constraints. So I think that including fleet vehicles would be really interesting, but we didn't have kind of as much information on those as we do on kind of passenger EV registrations in the state.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have a question on the line? I don't see any hands raised. I know this was extraordinarily thorough, but certainly there's got to be something burning in the audience. While we're waiting for those, Alice, I'll ask you, in terms of future activities for the CTC, if someone is interested in getting involved, what what would they do to go ahead and get involved, and B, what would they expect to do in terms of time commitment and activities for future CTC events?
Sure. Yeah. They would email me to get involved. So we're working on making sure that the group we're pulling together has good representation across disciplines, geographies, and sectors, but that we're also keeping it small enough for conversation and relationship building. So it could be that there's already somebody at somebody's organization who's involved, and we'd be happy to make sure that we're helping to make those connections. And in terms of time commitment, we're looking at sort of quarterly involvement at the moment, but also with potential for higher and lower levels of commitment in terms of putting together working groups and helping do some of that more in-depth research, development and review and focus areas. So it kind of depends on where you're coming from, but for the most part, it's not, a huge lift on time, and the goal is to get a mix of conversations between stakeholders and members, and of information coming in from outside experts as well. And I want to just touch on the question you asked Jackie also real quick. One of the other projects we're working on in CARTEEH is for the involved in the city of Houston, and we are looking at public fleets in that study. And so depending on the models and tools that we're using, one of the things we did there was collect data from a number of different public agencies and institutions on their EV planning and current EV fleets, and thinking about how they can work with the needs in the general public to make sure that they're providing the infrastructure that the fleets will need and that the public can benefit from, with a specific look at those sort of distributive justice, environmental justice communities, and creating equitable access to vehicles and charging and clean air from that perspective.
Well, thank you, Alice. I appreciate that. That was extraordinarily thorough, and and useful. So for any of those on the line or watching for the millions of folks that we assume will be watching this recording in their free time, please do not hesitate to reach out to Alice with any interest or any thoughts. So it does look like we have one question, quite a little bit more administrative, but Susan Alvarez indicated that they received an email notice this morning about a webinar yesterday about the TxDOT EV plan, but the link doesn't seem to be working. And so she was asking, she was wondering if Alice, you could provide a link to that plan.
Yes, I should be able to do that.
Okay, so Alice can go ahead and drop that in the chat. And so while we're waiting for yet another question, I'll go ahead and ask Jackie another question. So when thinking about the equity scenario, what other factors might you consider, moving forward?
Yeah, so I think an important one to consider will be kind of that at-home charging, especially when we're thinking in terms of equity. So people who own their own homes are more likely to be able to install very easily their own home charger. But I think we're moving towards kind of a space where we need to be thinking about renters and kind of that multifamily housing and having access to charging there, and how that can maybe be kind of publicly accessible as well. And so I think that's something to definitely consider, as well as kind of alongside other incentives to switch to an EV. And so if we start seeing, and I don't know as much about it from the US perspective, but I know in kind of Europe and the UK, they're seeing an expansion in the used EV market. And so maybe kind of making that connection so that people who can't afford kind of to buy a new EV would have maybe access that way as well.
Yes, absolutely. That's extremely helpful and certainly an area that we'll need to be keeping a close eye on moving forward. Susan, I did notice that you had your hand up. Do you have an additional question, or was your hand up to ask?
Yeah, I actually did have a question, and I just tried the link you gave me, and I got a notification that says your connection is not private. Attackers might be trying to steal your information from ftptext.gov. So, and that's the message I keep getting. And so I don't know what's going on with their system. Maybe they don't have a certificate. That's not my question. My question is, there are a lot of groups looking at EV infrastructure across the state. I'm in on a North Texas Transportation Electrification Alliance. The city of Dallas is active with the COG. I haven't seen much on TxDOT, and my worry is we have a lot of groups working on this, but I'm not sure how well they're coordinating internally. Can you speak to coordination on this effort and others?
That might be more of a question for TxDOT. So I'm not sure I'm quite prepared to respond on their behalf on that one. So
Okay. Well, do they really want comments then, I guess? I'm just surprised because we have multiple departments bird dogging this issue, primarily because of pending funding and because of our current non-attainment status for air quality. So it's a fairly critical thing, and I think everybody is looking for good information and is wanting to do it. But I could spend all my time on webinars learning about stuff from different people. I'm just curious. That's all.
Well, we
we're
appreciate
glad
that.
you tuned in to learn from us.
Yeah, we appreciate that, and we're sorry we can't speak more. And we know there's a lot
Yeah,
of moving
well,
parts right now.
understood.
We've all been drinking from the fire hose, so to speak. So, yeah, apologies for not being able to be more specific. But so the other item I was going to mention is that I was able to access the plan through that link. So I'm not sure, maybe you have some sort of firewall set up if you were trying to access it
Maybe.
through TxDOT. So in any case, that's one thing to try. Maybe try on a personal computer or your phone. We do have one other question from Carl Rupkins. What environmental costs or benefits are you currently considering?
Yeah, so in the tool itself, we are just considering the switch from kind of internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. And we did take into consideration Texas's energy mix within that. So we use the GREET model to calculate what kind of the difference will be from gasoline to internal combustion, from gasoline to electric, based on kind of what the energy you're using to charge your vehicle would be. Um, and then in that equity scenario, we did include kind of that reduction in emissions. So we have that additional kind of environmental, but that's not included in the calculator or in the tool just because it's different. We calculate that on an annual basis, and we did get pretty granular in terms of the emissions data and yeah, the exposure that we were calculating for those neighborhoods as well. And so doing that on a larger scale would just have taken, more time and would have made the calculator a little bit, or the tool a little bit harder to use.
Thank you, Jackie. So we have another question. Will the increased charging stations lead to more power outages due to the aged grid?
I'm gonna leave that one to you, Alice. We didn't take into account, we specifically didn't look into kind of the energy considerations of kind of what you would need to support this. I think especially when you look at the Austin one. And I will say that with that Austin plan, they are hoping to use 100% renewable energy, which was something we didn't again model because we were basing ours on 2025, and we don't see that as being kind of realistic at that stage. But maybe by 2050 they would get there. So.
That, yeah, I'd say that goes back to the making sure we're getting those interactions and collaborations between the transportation sector, the charging stakeholders, and the energy grid sector. And so one of the things we're doing in some of our other projects is bringing those sort of baseline data and projections together to also look at how we can mitigate pulling a lot from the grid at the same time from the transportation sector as we see for usage, other types of usage. And so that's looking, for example, at different times and different areas. And so, if there's residential areas that you might have heavier charging overnight and commercial areas where you might have heavier charging during the day, you might be able to regulate or incentivize or recommend different locations and times of day for charging. So if you have heavier pulls in the middle of the night when people aren't necessarily turning on lights and using other utilities, you can try and work to balance out that demand on both sides. So you could think of that even similar for all of the transportation people who we have listening to doing things like transportation demand management, where you're trying to reduce congestion because you've got these peak demands at peak times. It would be kind of a similar kind of way of looking at the charging element in that transportation behavior area and thinking about how you can mitigate having those really high spikes in peak demand and measuring it out better.
Thank you, Alice. So I think that's a question that everyone from transportation professionals to just the buddy you have that knows nothing about transportation is asking. So again, I think an area similar to equity, very important, one that we're looking at on a number of different projects here at TTI. But one that we'll kind of continue to learn a lot about. We have one other question. Considering the range of electric vehicles and the anticipated increase in home charging, are you considering how that will affect the number of needed chargers in urban areas?
Yeah, so not specifically in our current calculations, but this is kind of why I urged caution with the Austin numbers that we were showing. I don't think that they're going to need that many chargers, but the estimates that we used in that were based on research from about 5 years ago that was taking into account home charging. But I do think that kind of changes in this technology, as we see increases in speed of charging as well, as long as kind of we make sure that the grid can kind of handle that alongside, I think we're not going to need as many as kind of some of maybe the calculator is or the tool is showing at the moment. But I think on a short-term scale, I do still think that maybe we're going to need to ramp up, especially in a lot of our smaller and mid-size kind of regions. But I think that's a good point and it's something to kind of look out for, kind of new research on that in the future. I do think kind of understanding how much is home charging versus outside of the home charging is going to be extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. Muted myself is what I did. Sorry. I was going to say, I just dropped a link in the chat. There's an article a couple weeks ago that KXAN provided where they talked a bit about EV charging deserts in the suburban communities in Austin. So again, something that folks are beginning to think about and beginning to understand. So certainly something that we're going to continue to look at and learn from. So that doesn't look like we have any other questions. Unless something pops up really quickly, I'm going to go ahead and thank our speakers one more time and thank all of those that joined today. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you very much to Alice and Jackie for their time, both today presenting, answering these wonderful questions, as well as putting these presentations together. We really appreciate the time that you folks took. And again, all of those that joined today, we appreciate it. So we will go ahead and end this recording, and we look forward to seeing everyone at future webinars. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks.
Thank you.